You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun. It could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 279 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. Most of the stories I'm going to talk about on today's show revolve around the G20 Summit. This is a meeting of the world leaders of, 20 really big countries in Argentina. A lot of stories around Mohammed bin Salman and his attendance at the meeting. We're supposed to have a Trump-Putin meeting, potentially, some signings between the U.S., China, Mexico on trade, and all this kind of stuff. I'm really not of the opinion that, the G20 is like the meeting of the great minds of the world. I don't think because you have like Trudeau, Theresa May, Merkel, and Macron all sitting together in a room that they're going to come up with a great policy that, solves all the world problems. However, I think there are, potential for, good or bad things to happen here. So foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com is the URL for the show. Check out libertarianinstitute.org where you could find my daily news roundup, this show, and I post there in the blog section. And that's, the Libertarian Institute, the great site put together by Scott Horton, Sheldon Richman, and Jared LaBelle. And for those of you who really want to support the show, check out my Patreon page, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus. Got some new bonuses I'm offering up on there, so if that incentivizes you to go ahead and donate to the show, please do it. And, always let me know what you'd be interested in to donate to the show. And let's get into the meat of today's show. The first story I have is about this new U.S. class of destroyer, the Zumwalt class. These were designed to be kind of the United States ship killer destroyers. It's supposed to be like a stealth destroyer with big guns. Looking at the battlefield in today's world, there's long-range missiles and long-range torpedoes that could really prevent U.S. ships from ever getting, close to whatever they're trying to target, whether it's an aircraft carrier or another ship. So what they do is they are now trying to build a stealth ship just like they built the F-35, which is a stealth plane that would be able to bypass the radars that are so essential for these missiles to work. The Zumwalt class of destroyers are the most expensive destroyers, and I think they're the second most expensive ships in the U.S. fleet. I think the Reagan class of the aircraft carriers are more expensive. The ships were designed with two massive guns, and I think these are actually the 155 millimeter guns on the ships now aren't even the original guns that were supposed to be on there. They're supposed to be much more advanced than that. These 155 millimeter guns, though, they're supposed to be the big ship killing guns on the ship. Turns out that there's a problem. The ammunition for these guns are about $1 million a round, which really isn't sustainable when you think, they probably gotta pop off these things all the time to make sure, the guns are all targeting and working properly. $1 million a round is extremely expensive. And so, the Pentagon, and I think I talked about this on probably an early episode of the show. We're talking, double-digit episode of the show, that the Pentagon actually scrapped the program for the ammunition. And so now you had this stealth ship, a very expensive ship, and essentially you've neutered it because the two big guns on the ship don't have ammunition. So now they're looking for a new kind of, gun to put on the ship. Who knows how much money this is going to cost, probably more so, even though it's a, inferior product now. You also have that, the guns aren't the only problems on the ship. There's engineering, propulsion problems, and all kinds of other stuff that have really changed the design of ship over the time and have made it less and less stealth. I think, you've kind of had this problem on the F-35 too, that as you've run into more problems, you've had alter the plane in ways that, takes away this very sensitive build of the machine that's meant to deflect the radar. So just like the F-35 project, just like the missile defense products, this is insanely expensive. Hundreds of billions of dollars are being poured into these ships, just like the almost $1 trillion tab that you're going to end up from the F-35 and the hundreds of billions of dollars that have been spent on the development of these missile defense systems. And then, they don't even work. The missile defense systems aren't accurate anywhere near 100% of the time. The F-35 is still not a very great plane. And, these Zumwalt class of destroyers are probably not going to be ready by their 2021 deadline. They're going to be way over budget, and they're going to be inferior to the initial project offered. Now, it's not like Congress is then going to say, well, boy, we really got ripped off this time, and we're no longer going to buy ships from this ship maker, and we're no longer going to buy planes or contract with Lockheed Martin for these missile defense products. They've shown us that they can't, be trusted to provide the product that they promise. This happened time and time and time again. But instead, the congressmen will continue to get their kit badge from Lockheed Martin. They will continue to distribute the contracts to all these weapons makers. And of course, I use Lockheed Martin for a stand-in for, whether it's Raytheon, Boeing, Honeywell. One of these days, maybe I could have somebody who's a little bit more of an expert on the individual companies on and talk about the show, or on the show. Another note is that the U.S. has signed the actual contract, I guess, with Saudi Arabia for the sale of $15 billion worth of weapons. This has already been approved by Congress, or I guess by the Senate. So I don't think there's a chance for these arms sales to be blocked. It includes some guided missiles and I think 46 THAAD missile defense batteries. Of course, many of these weapons I'm sure will be used in the war in Yemen. I know that THAAD are missile defense systems, so maybe to intercept some missiles being fired from Yemen, although I don't know if they would intercept those kind of missiles. But it's just, how Saudi Arabia continues to gain influence in the United States by spending big ticket money on, products from Lockheed Martin and all these other companies. And then, these companies then had the incentive to keep the U.S.-Saudi relationship in place, which continues to be counterproductive to the safety of the United States of America, yet we continue to pursue it. All right, so at the G20, most important story, of course, is that we're supposed to have this Trump-Putin meeting on December 1st. Doesn't happen. Trump canceled the meeting a day or two ahead of the date, saying that it is because Vladimir Putin has not released the sailors and the ships that were seized in the Kerch Strait incident. I talked about this on the last show, so if anybody's interested, I'll link to a video in the show notes page. It's a podcast. The guy does a pretty good job of breaking the whole situation down. Or if you listen to the last show of this podcast, I probably won't go back and listen to it. The only thing that I would add on is that apparently when the whole incident occurred, there were actually Ukrainian ships in the Sea of Azov and in the Black Sea, both headed towards the Strait of Kerch there. And so I think this does provide a little bit more justification for the actions of the Russians, especially firing on the Ukrainian ships, as it seemed like, that this was a little bit more of a coordinated move by Ukraine. People are kicking around a lot of theories as to why this happened. Some people are looking to blame Putin. There's certainly an argument here that Putin could be trying to provoke Ukraine into lashing out against Russia, and then this would give Vladimir Putin an excuse to maybe take a little bit more of Ukraine, or, we've kind of seen this as part of Russia's foreign policy, like what would happen in Georgia. They end up expanding their border by a couple miles, or with the Crimean Peninsula, that, when the West or a Western-backed country kind of oversteps, Putin has, I think, kind of realized that he could take a little bit in response to correcting that mistake. And so maybe at this point he's trying to provoke a mistake, and I think they talked about the canal linking the water on each side of the Crimean Peninsula, possibly, looking to seize that entirely. So, something like that isn't impossible, although I don't know how likely it is. It seems to me that, if we're just going by the most likely circumstance here, we have a president of Ukraine who's very nationalist, Poroshenko, and they have elections coming up in a few months, and he's not doing well in the polls, about 8%. So here he creates a situation where Russia, it's a position where he's able to paint the media narrative to be that Russia acts aggressively against Ukrainian ships. They declare martial law. That this is good nationalism. This brings the country together. It allows for, I think, a rallying around of the central state, and so it could be beneficial there. It also is going to back up the elections in Ukraine. So, if you're definitely going to lose the elections, if you could postpone them, you hold on to power a little bit longer, but maybe then circumstances change and, suddenly the odds are a little bit better for you. I think another possibility as to, what's going on here is that Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine, sees a situation where Donald Trump is about to meet with Vladimir Putin. After the Helsinki summit, we heard from Trump that he wasn't attached to the standing American position that had been reiterated and continues to be reiterated at the UN by our ambassador Nikki Haley, that Russia must return the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine before the U.S. would start to normalize relations with Russia. Let's remember here that the U.S. relationship with Russia under Donald Trump, despite the fact that the absolute narrative is that he's the puppet of Vladimir Putin, has actually been extremely negative during the Trump presidency. We're talking about sanctions, initiated by the U.S. against Russia, but then retaliatory sanctions as well. Dust-ups between U.S. and Russian forces in Syria. The war in Ukraine continues to smolder onwards. Incidents like the, Salisbury chemical weapons attack has led the United States to dispelling a lot of Russian diplomats in the United States, and I think even taking back some property owned by the Russian government, former consulates, and then Russia has responded in kind. And so when we look at the situation, combined with the fact that John Bolton is now the National Security Advisor, advocating that the U.S. withdraw from the INF Treaty, and he has taken on the role in the White House of mediating negotiations between the United States and Russia. The meeting between Donald Trump and Vladimir Putin is very, very important. And so to get back to where I kind of tangent off from, I think Poroshenko understands that, when Vladimir Putin talks to Donald Trump, he could probably, and I feel like, not to give Putin any real praise, but he does articulate the position of Russia well, when it comes to the United States and why Russia feels the need to maintain some kind of nuclear parity with the United States, and the actual events of Ukraine and what Trump's predecessor Barack Obama and his administration did in orchestrating a coup there. I don't think it's impossible that, Poroshenko was worried that Trump would drop the condition that the Crimean Peninsula must be returned to Ukraine and accept that this is now just Russian territory, especially with all the infrastructure and development that Russia, poured a lot of money into the Crimean Peninsula. The Ukrainian state was very weak and there was a lot of infrastructure needs. The economy was poor prior to this whole 2014 coup and everything. And so Russia was able to, provide a lot of development in the Crimean Peninsula, including a bridge that now links Russia and Crimea. And the video I'll link to in the show notes page on this issue, the guy who commentates the video, and he admits, that he has, I think his wife, it has family in Crimea and everything. And so that might be a bias, but, that bridge linking Crimea and Russia is really, kind of turning the Crimean Peninsula into mainland Russia. And so for Ukraine, I think if America drops the position that Russia must return the Crimean Peninsula to Ukraine, then Ukraine basically loses any claim to the Crimean Peninsula. This particular issue in the Strait of Kerch is absolutely important, because if Russia had annexed the Crimean Peninsula, then the Kerch Strait would not be Russian territorial waters. And so I think it's a way to kind of pin Trump on that issue, and that's what Ukraine is attempting to do there. But, those are just my thoughts as to, how I think what would make the most sense, what, kind of how the incentives line up, how that works out. And it ends up working because Trump cancels the meeting, which, I don't think, while this issue in Ukraine is extremely important, I still think the most important thing that Trump and Putin could have talked about is the INF Treaty. Most of the reporting coming out about the G20 Summit has to do with who is shaking hands with Mohammed bin Salman and how enthusiastic they are about it. None of these people at the G20 are, at least of the leaders that I could identify being there, are not people who I would, praise as great humanitarians. So I don't really care who shakes whose hand. Most of them are war criminals. Most of them steal money from their own people and funnel it to people who keep them in power, different businesses and stuff like that. It's all cronyism, whether it's a more socialist state or a more capitalist state. they all cheat, rob, and steal and enrich themselves and their connected inner classes at the expense of the rest of us. But it is interesting to note in the U.S., we now have Senator Lindsey Graham, who I never have anything good to say about, saying that he's going to withhold all key votes until the Trump administration allows the CIA to brief Congress on what they found. A leak in the Washington Journal reported that the CIA assessment finds with a medium to high degree of confidence that Mohammed bin Salman targeted Khashoggi and probably ordered his death. And so if this is the case, this is a CIA assessment. And especially, when we talk about within Washington, D.C., when there's a culture of actually believing the CIA assessments, I'm quite a bit more skeptical of them usually and don't value what they say quite as high. It could, present some real problems for Mohammed bin Salman in Saudi Arabia and now the Trump administration, because Trump has staked out the position that he doesn't care what Mohammed bin Salman did to Jamal Khashoggi. But if it turns out they ordered him be killed and chopped up, this is a little gruesome for TV. Trump has also planned a meeting with the Chinese president at the G20 Summit. Prior to the summit, he sailed a U.S. destroyer through the Taiwan Strait. To understand why this is a big deal, so China considers Taiwan a part of China, and then that would make the Taiwan Strait Chinese territorial waters. For a U.S. then ship to enter the Chinese territorial waters, they would have to respect whatever rules of navigation that the Chinese government sets forth. And I highly doubt that that's going to be allowing just any old U.S. destroyer to sail through there when they want, like the Taiwanese government will. And so by sailing the U.S. ship through the Taiwan Strait, I think in some ways it does signal not full U.S. support for China's one China policy, even though we continue to kind of emptily echo that is the U.S. policy. And it seems like such a counterproductive thing to do. It seems like a very Trumpian kind of thuggish thing to do as a way to intimidate your enemy before the big meeting. But as we look at, the U.S. and China being the world's two biggest economies, it makes absolutely no sense, to not have the most trade possible there to improve the lives of everybody in the, two nations as much as possible. And so for, to allow, these kind of issues to get in the way in this, kind of hawkish military stuff. And, that always does have the potential to, lead to some kind of conflict. Now, I would hope that China doesn't, sail one of their military ships in an attempt to block the U.S. Ship like the Russians did with the Crimean ship in the Strait of Kerch. It could happen. And then what? You know what I mean? Are we going to end up in a shooting war with China? That's not productive for anyone. Found an interesting story. Joanne Leone actually shared it on Twitter. And I'll just mention here that I was on the Around the Empire podcast again. Me, Joanne, and Will Porter did another roundtable episode, this time on the Khashoggi murder. So we do a lot of analysis and, information on that murder in that show. So if anybody's interested, go ahead and I'll link to that in the show notes page so you can easily find it and check it out. But I highly recommend watching it. I think it came out pretty good. As always, I have a few interesting things to say, and, Joanne and Will have a bunch of them. So it was a good show. But this particular story actually was Bulgaria has announced they plan to build a Trans-Bulgaria pipeline to take Russian natural gas from Turkey through Bulgaria into Serbia and I guess then the rest of Central Europe. I think this will probably be an issue for kind of the U.S. deep state community and possibly even Donald Trump. Natural gas sales to Europe are a big deal for Trump. He's talked about this with Putin. I think even at the Helsinki summit, this is something that he highlighted on and brought up. And so, this is a way, I think, for Russia to look to bypass some U.S. restrictions and sanctions that have prevented the construction of pipelines that would bring Russian gas directly from Russia into Central Europe, kind of going an end run around it. We'll see what happens in the Bulgarian government. Maybe suddenly some U.S. NGOs will find a lot of interest there, and maybe we could see a different government take power who suddenly decides that the pipeline is either too dangerous or not beneficial to Bulgaria, and it ceases to happen. I want to talk about this Mark Lamont Hill situation. This guy is apparently somebody who worked for CNN. I was unaware of him till he got fired. But essentially what he was fired over was his position on the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, I haven't gone back and looked at Hill's archives and, seeing everything that he's ever said about Israel and Palestine. And so maybe in there he has said something that is actually anti-Semitic or, Nazi rhetoric. But from everything that I'm reading, that, from clips that people are pulling of him, he's very pro-Palestine, and he believes the narrative that I also sign on to, that Israel is occupying Palestinian territory and oppressing the Palestinian people, and that at this point, the territory of Greater Israel is an apartheid state where the Palestinian people really do not have rights and the Jewish people do. And in that, you also have the fact that there's some Druze in Israel that aren't quite treated at the level of the Palestinians, but at the same time aren't, normal citizens like, the Jewish people of Israel. And then you have Bedouins, who are a little bit different from Palestinian, kind of more nomadic people, a different group who are treated like the Palestinians very poorly. Hill has made points in the past that people point to. The one I see the most common in articles really attacking him is when he, kind of said that it's unfair to say the Palestinians can't use violence. People say that this is him endorsing terrorism. That's not really what he's saying. That, you have the situation on the ground right now in Israel where the people of Gaza specifically are in a prison. They don't get enough food. They don't get the medical treatment they need. There's not enough medicine. There's not enough energy. There's not enough jobs. There's like 50% unemployment. A ton of the people who live there are refugees who cannot leave. They're stuck. If they try to leave, if they try to walk towards the border fence, they get within a couple hundred meters of it, and that it's fair game for the Israelis to shoot and kill you at that point. And we've seen this happen time and time again. And so there's violence constantly being enacted upon the Palestinian people. And so it's unfair to say that they can't respond with violence. Now, I don't advocate for it. I don't think it's a good policy. I think when the Palestinians respond with violence, it's only used by the, international media establishment to basically attack and condemn them and say, look, they're just a bunch of thuggish terrorists, which couldn't be further from the truth. I don't think that if America was under siege and there was an American city, maybe specifically in the South or in Texas, and you were being told that you cannot leave, we're not going to give you fuel, and barely any food or water gets in. I don't think they would be saying kindly. I think they would be, breaking down the fences. I think they would, be taking up arms and liberating themselves. Mr. Hill has, vocalized his support for the BDS movement. I have nothing against the BDS movement. I don't like sanctions. I think they're an act of war no matter who they're on. And so while I certainly don't support giving Israel $38 billion in aid or selling them weapons or any of this other stuff, I also don't think we should sanction the entire country. The boycott, especially boycotting goods that are made in settlements, I'm all for. The divestment, I also think is a pretty important platform there, and I'm in support of that. But the BDS movement is not an anti-Semitic movement. The people who support the BDS movement are not saying don't go to a Jewish business. They're not saying you shouldn't go to a doctor or a lawyer or whoever down the street in New York because they're Jewish. They're saying don't buy products made in Israeli settlements because there are Palestinians who used to live on that land who had it taken from them forcibly, possibly killing them in the process. So the attacks on Mr. Hill are absolutely unbelievable and disgusting. The fact that he lost his job for this, when at the same time, a story that really hasn't been covered in the mainstream media is that the Israeli Supreme Court has okayed torture against Palestinians, right? So this should be the absolute disgusting story, and anybody supporting this position, we could fire, because in the United States, we understand how you could get carried away in the heat of anger and allowed torturing of people, but something that's absolutely cruel and disgusting, and it doesn't produce any useful information, and it only harms your society. And, yet this isn't something that's getting coverage or condemnation. The torture we're talking about here is stress positions, which basically means you keep somebody in an extremely uncomfortable position for, hours and days at a time. There's one particular position that was okayed by the Israeli Supreme Court, which is called a banana position. You're put on like a foot high stool. There's like, a foot by foot platform on the top of it. and then you're shackled to the legs of the stool bent backwards. And so, your spine is curved like a banana, your legs and your arms are underneath you. It's absolutely disgusting and painful. And, it's not like these are people who are convicted even in Palestine who get this treatment, just, those who are unfortunate enough to be labeled as enemies of the Israeli state. And just to expand, this isn't even to condemn all the Jewish people who live in Israel who, just like I don't condemn all the people who live in America who have turned a blind eye to, the drone wars, the torture program, the war in Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya, Syria, Yemen, etc. We're not all monstrous people. We're not all Nazis or oppressors or anything like that. But we certainly turn a blind eye to the war criminal leaders. And so whether it's Netanyahu, George Bush, Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, Dick Cheney, or Donald Trump, they're all terrible people, and we're not all responsible for their crimes. And so, I don't think, and I didn't read any rhetoric here from Mr. Hill that, is a blanket condemnation of every Jew who lives in Israel. This story does shed some light on, though, why it's so important that we support people who do stand up for the Palestinians. Here we have Rand Paul taking what's going to be an extremely unpopular stance, and that's against a $38 billion aid funding bill to Israel. First of all, good on Rand, because it's very easy to attack foreign aid to a country like Pakistan, Egypt, to the Palestinians, or, he always had talked about countries that burn our flags. But here he's also talking about cutting aid to a very affluent country who may be a U.S. ally, but is only going to use that money to further the oppression of the Palestinian people. And, when America, we have poor people over here, veterans who are suffering and everything like that. And yet we're going to give $38 million away to a country who provides universal health care and education. But, Rand's going to be slandered for this. And so any kind of, support, retweet his tweets on this. If you're calling congressmen, call him and tell him you support this move, that he does have the backing of Americans, and that we know that there's an establishment voice that's going to be critical of him for this, but that isn't reflective of everyone else. A few things about Korea, and then I'll wrap up here. We have a North Korean soldier defecting to South Korea. One thing I talked about at kind of the beginning of the Korean peace negotiations, that a risk Kim Jong-un was taking is that as you ease tensions between North and South Korea, it could make it easier for North Koreans to defect to South Korea. And so it'll be interesting to see how Kim Jong-un responds for this. I've talked on the show about the demining of the DMZ, the destruction of guard posts along the DMZ. I think, they have reopened a rail line from North to South Korea. So that obviously means that there's not any barriers in the way along that rail line. And I think one of these soldiers actually defected as a guard post was being blown up. And so hopefully that, this doesn't invoke the response in North Korea, that you have, Kim Jong-un kind of cracking down and hardening the border, not necessarily because he's concerned about people coming across, but people trying to flee his country. Michael Malice aptly, I think, points to the North Korean people as, hostages of the Korean state. And so I think something that also we could see that is important here is that the peace process is important to providing a situation where the hostages can leave. And, this is an example of that. As I mentioned, there's now a rail line connecting North and South Korea. A train traveled from South Korea with some diplomats up to North Korea. Another just positive sign towards peace, just like the handshake, just like the, trips from the South Korean president to North Korea, the summit between Trump and Kim Jong-un. These are absolutely positive, and help to further the peace process. I have a few more things to talk about, but I'll bring them up on shows throughout the week. foreignpolicyfocus.libsyn.com, the Libertarian Institute for all my work, my daily news roundup, the show, some writings on the blog section as well, libertarianinstitute.org there, Foreign Policy Focus on Patreon, so patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus to donate to the show. immersionnews.com is my own news website, and then my Minds name, minds.com/immersionnews. Minds is an awesome crypto social networking site built on the blockchain with the goal of decentralization. So think about checking that out and all my other work.